Heyo and welcome to How Would You Build, a little series in which I take your favorite characters from fiction, fantasy, and all forms of media and attempt to build them as lore accurate as possible in Dungeons & Dragons 5th edition. In this series, we'll be using all source books from Wizards of the Coast, except for the 2024 revision of the Player's Handbook. If you have any suggestions for characters, make sure to drop them in the comments below, join the Discord to post an official request, or ask me directly during one of my Twitch streams. Additionally, the full character build written down with backstory suggestions will be available on my Ko-fi. In this episode, we'll be building the loose cannon of Zaun, once known as Powder, now known as Jinx. This build will contain spoilers for the first season of the show, so if you haven't watched it, I wholeheartedly recommend you give this quality show a try. If you don't care about spoilers though, we'll try to do our best to build this insane, unhinged, and incredibly intelligent character as close as possible to the show. This means that we want a character with a wide array of weapons that can cause destruction from a small scale to a very wide scale. Both those scales though include a lot of explosions and elaborate traps that also end in explosions. Lastly, we want a character who is able to improvise and discover new technologies through her sheer inventiveness, and we also do want a character who falls prey to the manipulations of others and of her own traumatized mind. And so let's begin with stats. We will be building Jinx's ability scores using the standard array. First off, we put a 15 in intelligence. All across the show, we see her tinkering around with the idea of making grenades and weapons, which she eventually makes and modifies. Although not very effective at the beginning, she learns and develops her ability to make destructive inventions for her purposes. Next, we put a 14 in dexterity. She is nimble and sneaky in her earlier years and manages to avoid blows using mostly reactions and reflexes. In the end though, our choice of player race will have these two stats be the same at the beginning, so we shouldn't worry too much about this. After this, we put 13 in charisma. She has been shown in the show to be able to manipulate others with the way that they perceive her being innocent. Savika, for example, was blind to the room being trapped with sleeping gas, and people who've heard about her don't know exactly how to act around Jinx. Then we have Constitution and Strength. Jinx does get overwhelmed by Echo and sheds blood quickly. Even after her late transformation from Shimmer, she is still quite weak physically. She can hold a Firelight of similar build in place for a moment though, and does have a hard life that requires at least some measure of strength and climbing around, so we won't dump it. Wisdom though, on the other hand, we will dump. Jinx is aloof, distracted, and her past has left her so deeply traumatized that essentially any aggression that she perceives as a threat triggers a trauma response. She does also actively hallucinate. For Jinx's race, we will obviously choose the Variant Human. She is made of the same flesh and blood as her compatriots, but she is incredibly special and skilled. We will put a +1 in dexterity and a +1 in intelligence. We'll also give her the acrobatics bonus skill proficiency. She has been shown jumping around rooftops her whole life, and while not particularly good at it, she is very much proficient in tumbling around. We do give Jinx the Gunner feat, thanks to her race, to represent the fact that she was always shown to be very proficient with firearms. This also allows her to fight with guns in close quarters, whacking our opponents with them to set up a devastating shot. If your setting includes guns, this is a very powerful feat to obtain to avoid future reloading issues. For Jinx's background, there is a point to be made that Faceless could work, hanging around her two personalities as Jinx, the criminal, and Powder, the very innocent, highly traumatized child. We, on the other hand, will choose criminal, and we will be leaving the dual personality and hallucinations for role-playing purposes of her low wisdom stat. This background gives us proficiency in deception to use our looks to our advantage when trying to manipulate people, stealth to be able to be a sneaky little child in our earlier days, and also thieves' tools. While we're not very good at lockpicking, we do tinker around with small components. For our equipment, we also gain a crowbar to pop open funny looking crates. This item does give you advantage on those checks specifically. Common clothes for a Zonite, which means we can modify them with bits and bobs of metal, leather, paint, and all sorts of knickknacks. And finally, we get the feature Criminal Contact. It starts with a caring vendor, a manipulative Silco, and will probably continue with a visionary Savika. Jinx is a loose cannon in many ways, but she is also easy prey for manipulative criminals who use her pretty much like a weapon. In the end though, they do end up overstepping quite a bit, which makes her realize that she has been misled. This leads to her usually turning on her criminal contacts, and in the end, gaining power and respect from the underlings of said criminals. And now for Jinx's levels. While you could grab half of your levels into a half caster or full caster, and the other half into fighter, I am going to go all in Artificer. This is going to enable us to have lots of fun little combos and to keep our magic mostly technological. Level 1, we will grab Artificer. This grants us proficiency in light and medium armor along with shields, not like Jinx ever uses anything other than light armor. Additionally, it also grants us proficiency with simple weapons and, most importantly, we'll get Thief's Tools, Tinker's Tools, and Alchemist Supplies proficiency. These tools will allow us to manipulate fine components such as our small little beginner grenades and more mechanical components as we get more and more experience with them. Alchemist Supplies also could allow us to make Alchemist Fire, a tool that could be interpreted as a beginner grenade. This class also additionally grants us proficiency in Constitution and Intelligence saving throws for those concentration checks and to see through at least some illusions. For the skills, we will get Investigation and Perception. Jinx, while she does hallucinate quite a lot, is still an adept individual at figuring out things she doesn't necessarily understand and at least noticing people in the background. For the equipment, we obtain 2 simple weapons. We'll simply go for a dagger and another dagger flavored as a screwdriver, as she is seen using that tool a few times in the show. For weapon, we will begin with a light crossbow with 20 bolts. If your setting allows it, make sure to reflavor this as a toy pistol. This will be our main weapon to survive until we get our subclass at level 3. Consider using padded bolts as well to explain that this weapon just doesn't shoot through enemies but knocks them out with a pebble to the head. Studded leather will be our main thick clothing when Jinx is young, and later on we'll adapt and mix them up to have her final look. Additionally, we also do get Thieves' Tools as an item. This will be very useful for many of our features later on, so make sure you hang on to these. And finally, a Dungeoneer's pack filled with all sorts of knickknacks. Next up, Artificer 1 does give us firearm proficiency. If your setting allows it, definitely give Jinx proficiency with these, because even as a child, she was shown to exhibit extreme proficiency with them. After this, we have Magical Tinkering. This little feature here lets us replicate the little chunk bombs that child Jinx, should we say Powder, made back in her thieving days. You can imbue mechanical elements with a puff of smoke, maybe an audible metallic clinking, or maybe some other form of distraction. Later down the line, we can use this to imbue some of our grenades with near hallucination-like visuals, or maybe even small messages taunting your opponents. For spellcasting now, we will obtain the cantrips Firebolt and Prestidigitation. Firebolt in this case represents our ability to ignite things using the sparks left by our gunshots, and Prestidigitation does add a few more visual effects to our silly little bomb. For first level spells, we get the Alarm spell to practice setting up tripwires, the Detect Magic spell, because as we see in the world of Arcane, magic is very much visible. Then Identify for Jinx's uncanny ability to research technology she's not seen before, and Expeditious Retreat so we can scurry away to safety when the odds are not looking good. For our second level of Artificer, we obtain the feature Infuse Item. This gives us 4 infusions, otherwise known as passive buffs, that we can apply to some of our non-magical items. We will get Repeating Shot so that we can put a few bullets into our little toy gun and shoot about 4 times as many as we put in. Next up, we get Enhanced Defense. If your setting is grueling, make sure you use this infusion to survive. After that, we have Replicate Bag of Holding, so that you can have a comically large bag full of thieving goodies. And finally, Replicate Wand of Pyrotechnics, so that we use that little niche rule of getting a common magic item instead of some of the recommended items. This will be flavored as Jinx gathering a number of parts every morning to make a little grenade go pop. At level 3, we get our third level of Artificer. This grants us the right tool for the job. At this level, Jinx has had the incident happen with the unrefined Hextech core, and her criminal life has just started. Of course, a criminal life means that you have to be quite crafty, so Jinx can always tinker with what's in front of her, even if she has to make temporary tools made of scrap to be able to tinker around with things. Talking of tinkering, you could use Tinker's tools to, for example, create intricate mechanical traps like hunting traps from the player's handbook, and alchemist supplies to make alchemist fire to get a little taste of our grenades. Now, if you stick a hunting trap to an alchemist fire, we get a miniature version of our chompers. They go kalamp and then they explode in fire. At this level, we will now replace the Wand of Pyrotechnics for our enhanced arcane focus when it comes to our infusions. This will become very useful for our artillerist subclass. This subclass grants us proficiency in woodcarver's tools and a few spells. At this level, we obtain Shield, which can be reflavored as Jinx's uncanny ability to dodge attacks literally out of nowhere with such little movement as a head tilt. Thunderwave can be a more powerful chomper. It cannot clamp to a foe, but you can simply drop it on the ground and have it explode your enemies in a cube. And most importantly of all, we have our main feature, Eldritch Cannon. We can now summon a proper handgun using the Force Ballista. But we could also just flavor this as adjusting our newly acquired rigged up gun, blasting from the same weapon with 2 different attacks. Since most enemies don't care about resistances to these damages, it should be okay to flavor this as coming from the same place. Now, of course, you might be thinking, there's still 2 other options. There's the Flamethrower and the Protector, and while these options are powerful in their own rights, we won't use them much for the majority of this build. At least not yet. Though you could use the Flamethrower as a miniature version of Pow Pow to force a dex save against the hail of bullets. For spell casting, we finally obtain 3 slots of first level, and at this level we can now add our subclass spells, namely Shield and Thunderwave. At level 4, we obtain our 4th level of Artificer, and at this point we get the Warcaster feat, a very powerful feat. This, combining with the Gunner feat that we got from our variant human race of choice, allows us to shoot in close quarters with our spells. So make sure that you hold a firelight for a little too long, only to then shoot them in the back. Additionally, we no longer need to worry about keeping a hand free for the mechanical purposes of DnD spellcasting. Our concentration also has just become a lot harder to throw off. For spellcasting, we now get the Fairy Fire spell added. This will be flavored as Jinx just throwing a little coat of pink paint on her enemies to make sure that they are far easier to hit. At least as long as she reminds you to hit the pink stuff. Let's be honest, she might forget. At level 5, we obtain our 5th level of Artificer. At this level, we obtain Arcane Firearm. It has arcane in the name, and well, it just happens to be in the class. With this ability, we can finally have our machine gun Pow Pow ready to make mayhem happen, adding a d8 to 1 damage roll of a spell we cast. We shall also remove repeating shots now that we have acquired Pow Pow, our enhanced arcane firearm, and replace it with the Illuminator's tattoo from our feature Replicate Magic item. We finally have the signature tattoo with the added perk that she can do finger paint thanks to it once per day. This does add a heck of a lot of silliness with buckets upon buckets of metaphorical paint that we can use to customize our trapped scenes with paintings that only Vi or Caitlyn can fully grasp. Feel free to reflavor the paint as not being invisible but just meaningless for anyone other than the person that you have selected to be able to understand it. For artillerist spells at this level, we obtain Scorching Ray. These will represent our 3 rapid shots of our machine gun, and eventually we will get more if we use more resources, or if an enemy runs away from us and triggers another spell. Shatter is the next artillery spell we get. This is our grenades, but even more powerful, as this time they can damage structures, and most importantly, people. For spellcasting, we now have 4 slots in our first level, and 2 slots for our second level. We will remove Expeditious Retreat, and now we can prepare our artillerist spells, always, but we will also get Pyrotechnics. Pyrotechnics allows us to cause havoc with pink smoke and blinding explosions, so feel free to flavor Pyrotechnics as you having already set up a trap somewhere but having just entirely forgotten where you put it. Though make sure that when you do cast your spells, you're always holding your machine gun Pow Pow for that d8 of damage. For the 6th level of Artificer, we obtain Tool Expertise. Our skill grows closer and closer to figuring out Hextech. Around here is when Jinx has her fight with Echo, so make sure to go out in a blaze of glory, only to be resurrected by your local wild alchemist. This marks a point of no return for our destructive abilities. For our infuse item feature, we obtain the Spell Refueling Ring and the Eye Eyes of Charming. We also should prepare Eyes of Charming if you've already had your encounter with the Wild Alchemist. As for all intents and purposes, Jinx has pink eyes after the Shimmer Resurrection, so Eyes of Charming are almost like contact lenses. Some people find your pink eyes interesting or pretty cool, and some are just weirded out by your strange color of eyes. Spell Refueling Ring is also just the blueprints for an extra explosive attack very soon. At this level we also get False Life. This represents the improved resilience Jinx has obtained after her Shimmer Resurrection. Fitting the description of this spell, she is imbued with a little of her life and a lot of fake life. At level 7, we obtain Flash of Genius. Jinx was told to weaponize Hextech, and now all she needed was a little breakthrough. She's getting closer and closer and closer and will no longer fail anymore. We also obtain a third slot of second level. At level 8 of Artificer, we will bump our intelligence by 2 using our ASI, and we can also now prepare the Lesser Restoration and Magic Mouth spells. Now, Magic Mouth is not very useful just yet, but very soon, in other words, next level, it will become incredibly important. Lesser Restoration represents her uncanny ability to recover thanks to our Shimmer-infused body, whereas Magic Mouth will allow us to refine our traps by taunting our victims into falling for a cry for help turned into a taunt. At level 9, we get our 9th level of Artificer. This allows us to obtain the feature Explosive Cannon. Now our gun can be rigged up with chompers and go kaboom if we're really desperate. For the artillerist spells, we finally obtain Fireball. Fishbones is now ready to go, so make sure you have Pow Pow ready for that D8 of extra damage. After all, this is just flavor, and flavor is free. We also do get Wind Wall, but I don't necessarily know how to flavor this spell, so if you can swap it up for something that you find interesting, feel free to do so. Otherwise, this spell is kind of just a bust. For spell casting, we finally gain 2 slots of 3rd level, in addition to Fireball and Wind Wall, Glyph of Warding. Make sure to remove Pyrotechnics as well from your selection of spells. Now this is where real traps begin. Now that we have Glyph of Warding, make sure you prepare those in your bag of holding so that you can transport the bombs without them breaking after you move 10 feet. This mainly works because bag of holding is an extra dimensional space. In other words, when your bomb is inside, it doesn't actually move. So here's a fun way to create your chompers. If you combine Glyph of Warding with the spell Shatter and you place it on a hunting trap, because it has the ability to open and close, it qualifies for the spell. For combat, the trigger for Glyph of Warding to activate could be that it moves 10 feet away from the point of creation. This simply means that you can clamp a chomper and then let the enemy move 10 feet away from you as they pass by, this being your little reaction attack, I suppose. For a trap trigger, it could explode 1 turn after the hunting trap closes. Another example could be the very explosive trap that happens in the scene with Caitlyn on topside. This simply involves a lot of glyphs of warding, or should we say chompers, with the spell Fireball stored into them. The trap trigger here is when the hunting trap closes. In other words, when it's disarmed or tripped, it triggers the entirety of the glyphs of warding. Another trap trigger could also be that Magic Mouth says a specific word, or that a certain number of glyphs of warding have been triggered, so that you can make sure that the enemies take all the explosions straight to the face. For level 10, we obtain Magic Item Adept. We can use more technology alongside our abilities, and Jinx is becoming more and more used to working with this kind of weaponry. Additionally, our enhanced arcane focus and enhanced defense both become +2, and talking of which, we also gain 2 new infusions. At this point, we have Replicate, Eyes of the Eagle, and Replicate, Ring of Mind Shielding. The Eyes of the Eagle are for those moments when Jinx has to rely on her Shimmer-infused senses, and Ring of Mind Shielding is a very fun item because her mind is entirely scrambled, and if you know that you're about to have your thoughts read, then you could use this item, make it turn invisible, and have Jinx be so entirely mentally gone that her thoughts have absolutely no shape to be read. Additionally, make sure you prepare Bag of Holding to do Glyph of Warding shenanigans. For spell casting, we can now prepare Guidance as a cantrip and Enhance Ability. Despite not fully grasping Hextech, Jinx still experimented with 1 stabilized crystal and managed to weaponize it. Guidance and Enhance Ability will allow us to boost our checks to try and understand Hextech. For level 11, we obtain another level of Artificer. This time, we get Spell Storing Item, which allows us to imbue 8 whole castings of Scorching Ray into our Arcane Firearm, in other words, Pow Pow. Additionally, we obtain 3 slots of of 3rd level, but our spell selection remains entirely unchanged. At level 12, we obtain the Meta Magic Adept feat. This allows us to get 2 hold points that we can use to either send a rocket very far away straight into the council by using distance spell to double the range of fireball from 150 feet to 300 feet, or we can also adapt one of the strange spells we get into a version of the correct element by using transmuted spell into either fire, or depending if we want it to be a hail of gunfire or explosive grenades. At this level, we'll also add dark vision because Jinx is usually seen in dramatic lighting or barely any lighting at all. At level 13, we obtain our next artillerist set of spells. This time we get Ice Storm, and while an ice spell doesn't really match, now that we have transmuted spell, we can flavor this into a hail of grenades that temporarily wreck the terrain around us. Damage is on the lower end though. We also do get Wall of Fire, which could be flavored as a shower of accelerants followed by a shot or a grenade, creating a burning blaze that can keep enemies far away from you as you crisp up the terrain. This could also serve as a good follow-up after one of your massive traps for Caitlyn. For spellcasting, we get another slot of 4th level, and this time we obtain Fabricate and remove Identify only temporarily though. Fabricate at this level is also for those times when Jinx just seems to have ammunition for all occasions. You could totally make some ammunition out of some raw materials that you have just created on the spot. At level 14, we obtain Magic Item Savants. As long as she gets the gist of a weapon or explosive, Jinx can blow stuff up with it. Additionally, we get an extra infusion slot and 2 more infusions known. At this point, I have decided to grab Replicate Amulet of Health and Replicate Ring of Protection. This is all largely dependent on how Jinx's story will unfold, so if she becomes sturdier because of her Shimmer-infused constitution, give her Amulet of Health. Otherwise, make sure to make her harder to hit through practice and skill at fighting. At this point, we start preparing our spell refueling ring, as this is simply flavor for a pool of particularly useful scrap to work with in a pinch. Additionally, we start preparing the cantrip Mending. Jinx simply doesn't have time to waste on manual repairs, and she can just kind of haphazardly put things together using a little bit of her acquired skill and tech. At level 15, we get our final artillerist feature called Fortified Position. Now we can have 2 cannons. You can reflavor, of course, the flamethrower as additional bullet hell from our dear Pow Pow to achieve a destructive hail of gunfire every single turn. After all, more of our bullets means less of our enemy's bullets. For spellcasting, we obtain our 2nd slot of 4th level, but our spell selection remains unchanged. At level 16, we can of course either bump dexterity or intelligence if you feel like it, but I personally would like to get Elemental Adept Fire. After all, nobody in the show that we have seen really does resist bullets. For spells, we also start prepping Absorb Elements. At this point, Jinx has endured so many explosions and the heat of them that they probably leave her largely unfazed. At level 17, we obtain our final 2 artillerist spells, Cone of Cold and Wall of Force. While Wall of Force is difficult and could maybe be reflavored as a piece of hex tech or maybe a window becoming unbreakable for a plot point, Cone of Cold, on the other hand, using transmuted spell, could be even more intense Pow Pow gunfire, leaving defeated enemies so full of lead at this point they should be statues. Finally, we also get a 5th level spell slot and 3 slots in our 4th level. At this point, we obtain only Cone of Cold and Wall of Force from our artillerist spells, but we don't prepare anything just yet. At 18th level though, we do start preparing skill empowerment to be able to reach the height of improvisation as we struggle to gain validation from the manipulative criminal figures in our lives. Additionally, we do also get Magic Item Master for more and more weapons and more traps and technology to use. At this level, we finally get our final upgrade for Infuse item. We also decide to obtain this time around Mind Sharpener and Brooch of Shielding from the Replicate Magic Item feature. Jinx doesn't really ever lose concentration in battle. She is aloof, but she revels in the madness of fighting. Oddly enough, she is also almost immune to catching bullets. Maybe the bullet casings in her hair actually ward off gunfire. At level 19, we obtain our next feat. This time we'll take Elemental Adept for Thunder, and of course, nobody is immune to grenades either. We also gain our 2nd slot of 5th level while our spells remain unchanged. And finally, we go to our level 20, where we gain Soul of Artifice. This means that we get 6 extra lives only time will tell how many of these Jinx will need to use before she manages to overcome her trauma and grow as a character. Additionally, we should attune to as many items as we are able to, as more weapons and more knickknacks means more confidence and more ability to resist enemy abilities and spells. Finally, the last spell we shall prepare is Creation. At this point, it would not surprise me if Jinx decides to create more and more destructive implements from thin air and junk, and she needs to imagine what such material would do with another material to create said inventions. Nothing better than her insane mind to picture or emulate such things. And so finally, what about the pros and cons of playing Jinx as she is portrayed in Arcane? Well, for the pros, we do have lots of damage. This both includes AoE and single target damage. Our concentration saves also happen to be extremely good from very early on. Our action economy is also absolutely fantastic. We have a consistent bonus action. Our action options are usually spells or very powerful cantrips, and we can also reactively blast an opponent that realizes that being close to us honestly does not do them a service. Lastly, we are also an arcane caster, which makes us incredibly versatile in our choice of spells and adapting to situations, since we can prepare different spells for different cases. For cons, we are incredibly squishy. Our constitution being 12 and not improving means that we either get that amulet of health at high level or we struggle with lower health. Jinx is quite squishy though, so that is lore accurate, I'll say. Utility could also use some work. Our spells are from the arcane type, but we handle magic mostly for our purposes, so we don't really have an incentive in interacting much with our opponent's magic. Most importantly though, there is friendly fire absolutely everywhere. Her spells involve blasts or huge cones, and this can be very dangerous if you have friends that don't want to be caught in the crossfire of your damage. The whole trap system with Glyph of Warding, Magic Mouth, and the other spells is somewhat complicated to set up, but when you do set it up, you are sure to surprise your table, and most importantly, the enemies who will fall onto your unhinged, insane traps as you leave them with a giggle and a spray of paint and smoke. This episode of How Would You Build focusing on Jinx as she was portrayed in Arcane. I hope that each and every one of you have enjoyed and that you agree with me on at least some of the decisions I made with this build. If you have different opinions, or if you prefer to build the Jinx with a little bit more of a martial touch, make sure that you tell me down in the comments. Feel free to drop your suggestions there as well if you want me to make a martial Jinx build or another character from Arcane or another piece of media that you like. Maybe do a little subscribble if you do want to see more of this, because that is the best way to tell me that you want to see more of these silly little builds. I will be seeing you all very, very soon, be it here on my Twitch or maybe even on the Discord for more cozy little D&D builds and some game guides. Be well, be comfy, and be silly. Bye-bye!